just for the early part of this presentation, Ariel is going to talk with us, give us a little bit of an introduction to some texts, and then really walk us through, and we encourage your participation really throughout as you parse the texts and grapple with them a little bit. We'll love your participation. So if, again, folks can turn on their cameras so we can see you and turn off your mics just for now. And remember, when you have a question, just to unmute your mic so that we can hear you. So I'm going to hand it over to Ariel to start.
Thanks so much, Deb. Can we pull up the PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Can everybody see the PowerPoint at this point? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Hopefully, yes. I wanted to begin our thinking about the master-disciple relationship in the Hasidic tradition, first by moving toward an important quote from, how do I move forward? Thank you very much. A 20th century Hasidic, or perhaps neo-Hasidic thinker that I think many people may have heard of. That is, of course, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Born in Warsaw, raised in the heart of the Hasidic world, he left at a certain point, went to Vilna, then Berlin, and then eventually came to America just before the destruction of Polish Jewry. He, in many ways, translates the key ideas of Hasidism for an American audience. He does so in a beautiful American English idiom, but hiding behind almost every one of his works are key Hasidic ideas. Now, it's no surprise that in the realm of pedagogy, education, and spiritual leadership, this holds true. This particular quote, I think we'll see borne out in the teachings that I've assembled for you today. He writes as follows: everything depends on the person who stands in the front of the classroom. The teacher is not an automatic fountain from which intellectual beverages may be obtained. It's a nice image from the 1950s America there, going down to the drugstore. He is either a witness or a stranger. To guide a pupil into the promised land, he must have been there himself. When asking himself, do I stand for what I teach? Do I believe what I say? He must be able to answer in the affirmative. What we need more than anything else is not textbooks, but text people. It is the personality of the teacher, which is the text that the pupils read, the text that they will never forget. I think it's no overestimation to say that master and disciple, this question of soulful education, is really at the heart of Hasidism in general. But of course, this stands on very old chain of tradition within Jewish literature going all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. There are a few key stories that keep cropping up. Moses, Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, a prophetic example. Aaron, his children, a priestly example of what it means to serve a teacher, what it means to imbibe their wisdom, what it means to then carry that forward to the next generation, and then, of course, considering that from the opposite perspective, what does it mean to be a good teacher? These, of course, continue to be repercussive in the rabbinic world, where discipleship could be described as a defining feature of the rabbinic project. To be a rabbi, a rav, or a rabbi is to have students. One's authority is invested not primarily in the chain of tradition, at least after that breaks down at some point in the 2nd or 3rd century, but on the question of whether or not there's a circle of disciples that will gather around you. Pirkei Avot, one of the classic rabbinic works, the Ethics of Our Fathers, a section of the Mishnah, is really at its heart all about how are you as a good teacher and how do you become a good student. Now, there's an interesting shift in the medieval world. Maimonides, rationalists, is not all that interested in discipleship in a spiritual sense. For Maimonides and for many of those in his school, It's the ideas that matter more than the performance of education. He was a doctor, he was an educator, he was a teacher, but in terms of his legacy, many of his disciples never met him, and he refers to his own teachers as people whom he never could have met. There's a split, however, in the world of the Kabbalists. Already beginning in the 13th century, just after Maimonides, and perhaps even before, the notion of discipleship is crucial for Nachmanides, for Nachmanides' school, even before him, the Kabbalists of Provence. Oral tradition, received tradition, handed down from teacher to disciple, is the only way for knowledge to be conferred. To read it in a book is to get it secondhand. What's very interesting is that there's a second thrust within the world of the Kabbalists, which focuses on group creativity, especially around a charismatic teacher. If you look at the key sections of the Zohar, one of the most important books of Jewish mysticism, which emerges in the 13th century, one scholar has described interpretation in the Zohar as a jazz session, in that everyone sits around, that is the teacher and disciples. One verse or another is put to the forefront, and a series of variations on that theme are then offered. The more creative, the more inspiring, the more exciting, the better. These don't exactly stand in tension with one another, orality and tradition on one hand, and creativity on the other. Not exactly a dialectic, but they do push in slightly different directions. They continue into the world of Lurianic Kabbalah of the 16th century, in which there are a great number of charismatic mystics who all moved to Tzfat, Safed, in the north of Israel at the same time, and established themselves in a series of concentric circles around a couple of key figures. One of them is Rabbi Moses Cordovero, and the other is, of course, Rabbi Isaac Luria. In Eastern Europe, teachers were employed by the community, that is to say, rabbis, did two things. One was they decided legal queries, and the other was they gave a sermon. And they gave a sermon only twice a year. They gave a sermon on Shabbos Shuvah, which was the Shabbat, the intervening Sabbath in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they gave a sermon on Shabbat HaGadol, the Shabbat that precedes Passover. Now, the profundity of those days is not hard to imagine. On Shabbat Shuvah, everyone is thinking about issues of spirituality, and everyone is there in shul. The sermon for Passover is in order to remind people of the fundamental precepts of that particular holiday and to help them understand all of the preparation that they'll need to do. So there are itinerant preachers that move from one community to another, and they're the ones who speak on Shabbat. However, outside of the synagogue structure, in study halls throughout the 16th, especially the 17th century, and then into the 18th century, you find groups of disciples congregating around particularly charismatic and interesting leaders, but they have no connection to the communities around them, or at least not much of one. In Hasidism, you begin to see a merging of these two worlds, which is to say a core group of close-knit spiritual disciples around a particularly gifted, charismatic, and intellectual leader, but on the other hand, a leader, a Rebbe or a Tzaddik, who then takes on a public communal role as the fulcrum, the nexus of a particular Hasidic community. Now, the teachers of Hasidism, from the very beginning, were not only purveyors of a new spiritual ethos. That was a part of it. The message and the profundity of the ideas spoke for itself. But on the other hand, the embodied spiritual presence of the teacher, as Heschel points us here, the textbook rather than the text person rather than the textbook, is almost more important. There's a crucial story from the early years of the Hasidic movement about how the Baal Shem Tov first got to know the Maggid of Mezrich, who became one of his star disciples. The Maggid, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, who dies in 1772, heard about the Baal Shem Tov. He was apparently an infirm person, and the Baal Shem Tov was known for being able to heal people. So the Maggid took it upon himself to visit Mezhebozh, the town of the Baal Shem Tov, and to get to know this new spiritual leader. When he accosts the Baal Shem Tov and asks him to heal him, the Baal Shem Tov replies, "You should know that my horses don't eat matzah." The Maggid is obviously stunned. Not only is this person not going to help him, but he's given this bizarre, seemingly nonsensical, and frankly almost offensive answer. The Maggid stays for a little bit in that particular town, and for a while, late one night, a messenger from the Baal Shem Tov comes to visit him. The Baal Shem Tov would like to see you, tells the Maggid. The Maggid gets over his feelings of ambivalence about this new spiritual leader and decides to go. It's midnight. He comes to visit the Baal Shem Tov in the Baal Shem Tov's private study room. There's a book, something of the world of Kabbalah, on the desk in front of him. And the Baal Shem Tov asks him to begin reading. The Maggid does so. The Baal Shem Tov asks, "Can you explain this passage?" The Maggid says, "Sure," and he gives him one answer. The Baal Shem Tov shakes his head and says, "No, that's not right." The Maggid reads it again and provides an alternate answer. And the Baal Shem Tov says, "No, that's also not right." And the Maggid, understandably, throws up his hands and says, "So what do you want from me?" And the Baal Shem Tov opens up the book and says, "Shouldn't it be a little bit more like this?" He begins to recite the name of sages and of angels. The room is suddenly filled with holy fire and some sort of a light. Angels begin to lift off the page, and the words themselves become illuminated. According to the Maggid's testimony, this goes on for almost 2 hours. At that point, the Baal Shem Tov closes the book and says, "That's how we read Kabbalah." In many ways, this is in keeping with what the Hasidic masters did. They transformed the people around them, not simply by dint of their erudition, not simply through the conveyance of information, although that is key. It was the force of their personality, the profundity of their presence, that transformed the people around them. The key teachings that we're going to look at today come to us from Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Epstein of Krakow, who dies in 1823. He's a fascinating early Hasidic master who lives in the time of some of the first Hasidic thinkers and then lives all the way into the next generation, and in that way is somewhat of a bridge between one generation and another. In terms of spiritual discipleship, this seems to be one of the themes that preoccupied him quite a bit. Time and time again, his teachings return to this subject. The text assembled before us today should be seen as emblematic rather than exhaustive. However, I should note that in terms of actual pedagogy, that was left to one of his descendants, the great Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, this time, of Piazetzna, more famous as the Eish Kodesh, or the Rebbe of Warsaw, who is indeed the direct descendant of this particular thinker that we'll be looking at today, transformed these same ideas into a methodical, thoughtful, and practice-based approach to spiritual education. I want to pause for a moment. I've said a lot, and I want people to be able to respond and think together before we look at the texts themselves. If no one has anything, I'm happy to continue to those. We'll look at 5 of them together, and if we have time to get through them all, that's wonderful, and if not, you'll have something to read to. Unmute the mic.
People can also use the hand-raising function, which is next to the little icon of your video, so then we'll know if you have a question that should pop up on our screen.
Great. And feel free to stop me as I continue. So the first of the various texts that we'll be looking at today. Here is actually a copy of the first page of not the first edition of the Mor Shemesh, which is the work authored by Colonimus Kalman Epstein, but one of the early editions. That's the picture on the right. On the left, in the very tiny and impossible to read Hebrew, you'll notice something very strange. It's a copy of the text of the Pentateuch of the Bible. On the left of that is the traditional Aramaic translation, Rashi's commentary. So far, this is a very traditional, what's called a chumash that you find in the synagogue bookshelf. Then below that is the commentary of Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar, a Moroccan sage who was particularly beloved in Hasidic circles. And then at the bottom, the work of the Mor Shemesh himself, Rabbi Colonimus Kalman Epstein. His work was so beloved and so well-read in certain Hasidic circles that it was actually printed together with the text of the Bible for use in the synagogue. There's no other Hasidic book that reached that same level of integrated popularity. The first text that we have before us focuses on the question of, A, how do you find the right person to become your teacher? How do you know? And B, why is that person so important? Continue. He begins as follows, and all of these are particularly short excerpts from what are longer spiritual teachings. V'zeh hasiman hu muvhak me'eze ish lilmod Torah mipihu. This is the clearest and most significant sign regarding the person from whom we should learn Torah. If you receive something in divine service from this person, even though he hasn't said anything, and even if you don't see him doing anything in particular. If you can see that this person has a passionate inner fire kindled within their heart for the service of God, go and learn Torah from this person. For this passion, this fire, is a sign that this person can serve God always within his inner world with tremendous love. Ahava azah is in the word in Hebrew. And therefore, he can use his inner world to direct all those who have come unto the world along the upright path. This recalls an important Hasidic story that goes even farther than that story. The story is that of Rabbi Moshe Leib Saras. When they asked him, why did he go to visit the Maggid? He replied, I didn't go to hear the Maggid expound on the Torah. I went to the Maggid to learn how to tie my shoelaces. I thought of that actually when I watched one of my own teachers tying their shoelaces. The way that someone moves in the world often teaches you as much as what they do in front of the camera or in front of the classroom. This text actually goes one step farther. It's not only what the person says, and it's not only what that person does, although even the Mor Shemesh, and I think all of us would agree, those are crucial. The real thing that teaches you how, from whom you should be learning is what does that person do, quote unquote, during the off time? How do they move in the world? How do they carry them? What kind of dignity and inner fire have they kindled? How does it transform the way that they are? Not simply the way that they move in terms of teaching, not simply the way that they move even in a physical way, but can you see in their inner world a rich reservoir of spiritual inspiration from which we may become nurtured? In the Hasidic tradition, there's a true sense that a teacher becomes an embodiment of the Torah. There's a story about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev that when he saw the gartel, the prayer belt, falling from Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, one of the next generation of Hasidic leaders, he ran over and picked it up and tied it back on this young man. Why, when he was asked? He explained that just as you would pick up the mantle of the Sefer Torah when it begins to fall, so too would you have that for a student of the Torah. Any questions about this particular note?
We don't have a lot of video, so if you're raising your hand so you don't have a camera in front of you, we won't see you, so just speak up. We're informal in that way.
There's a story about Rabbi Zusha, one of the great disciples of the Maggid. When the Maggid died, they tried to reconstruct his teachings after his death. And they got together, all of his disciples, and asked who remembers what. And Rabbi Zusha was the last to go. They had gotten teachings from this person and another one, from this person, and a homily and a sermon and a Devar Torah here and there. But from Rabbi Zusha, they didn't get anything. He didn't have any Torah. And they asked him why. And he said as follows: when the Maggid began to speak, he would open up with a verse and say, "In the beginning God created," or something to that effect. And the moment the Maggid began to speak, I began to shake and I began to quake. And they'd have to carry me outside of the Beit Midrash and give me a timeout, because I was so overcome with the pathos of learning from such a teacher. And then I'd come back in, and he'd quote another verse, and they'd have to carry me out again. So Reb Zusha, counted amongst the key disciples of the Maggid, is counted not because of his acumen, not because of the amount of information he imbibed, but because he was transformed with having come into the presence of such a teacher, such a text person, rather than a textbook. The next teaching is going to continue this same point from a different perspective. Quoting from the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, which has a lot to say, and some of it is optimistic, the Moreh Shemesh picks up on this strange line of making books there is no end, and of much study brings weariness to the flesh. Then reflects on something that he saw in his own days, which is that none of the great Hasidic masters wrote their own books. Why, he asks? He continues. King Solomon is making mention of a great trait possessed of the true tzaddikim. Although they didn't produce books inscribed in writing, nevertheless, they accomplished something even greater. They instructed their disciples and trained many students. And as we've seen in the previous generations before us, these disciples spread out. He's talking about the early progenitors of Judaism, the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, the disciples of the Maggid, who spread out from town to town and spread the new religious ethos of Hasidism. They bear fruit and have been successful. Each of these disciples, and here there's a crucial wordplay, is an illuminated work. Of course, the word for book in Hebrew is sefer. But he reads this in line with sapir, or sefirot, luminous, or illuminated, and clear, bahir, which is to say that their hearts, these are the disciples, clearly shine with the service of the divine. So how does he return back to the verse, Asot Sfarim Harbe Ein Ketz, of making many books there is no end? Each of the tzaddik's students and the disciples of those students are individual books whose hearts radiate divine service. We're told that it's not fitting to compose a written work that will take so much effort and so much study with minimal results. Someone who's written a dissertation, which is often described as a book to be read by 3 people, this is something that resonates with me. When you invest in your students, transforming them into givers and not just receivers, that is in many ways the key to the Hasidic legacy. There's a tale about the Baal Shem Tov, and this is such an early tale that I think if it wasn't true, it could be true, that he had forbade his students from writing down his own teachings. But he had a dream one night in which one of his students showed him a book. It turns out that student was actually a demon in the dream. That became clear over the course of the dream. And the book was a book of his own teachings. He woke up, the Baal Shem Tov did, and he asked his students, so which one of you has disobeyed me and is writing down these teachings? One of them in the back raised his hand and showed the Baal Shem Tov a book. And he said, this book is a book of your teachings, word for word, written down. I've been quite assiduous in this matter. The Baal Shem Tov looks at it, sees that it's a word-for-word transcription, says, there's not a single word here that is mine. I think I'd like to pose that question to those of you who are with us today. How could a word-for-word transcription not be the words of the teacher?
Hi, this is Louis.
Hi, Louis.
Hi, Rabbi. How are you? So I don't know if I have an answer to the question other than the fact that lived experience can't really be captured in words. And I have a few teachers who, when they give Divrei Torah, are very hesitant to, if they give them on Shabbat or a holiday, they're hesitant to send them out for many reasons. But one of the reasons I've heard cited is that it is not the same, that written words have different meaning than spoken words. So I think I'd say that.
Lived experience is a wonderful way of putting it, Louis. This notion that the written word conveys something, but it's more of a gesture, whereas the orality of discourse between a living disciple and a living teacher in a specific moment is an encounter that can never be mirrored in an echo of that's captured in the written word. So even if they're the exact same notations, which is to say the words are the same, the totality of that experience and the imprint that it will leave upon the disciple, the way that the disciple is changed, and by extension, I would suggest also the teacher, that cannot happen through the written medium. Wonderful, Louis. Thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts? So if not, I think we'll continue. Please, as Seb said, raise your hands, shout out. More than happy for this to be a give and take. You might ask the question, why you need a teacher at all? There are lots of books on Jewish wisdom, in English, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in Ladino, in Spanish, in French, in German, you name it, we have them. That wasn't exactly the same for the Morva Shemesh. In the 19th century, there were fewer books, but on the other hand, the key texts were there. So why does one need a spiritual teacher? He reads this back into the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who, according to the Midrash, studied Torah. Now, is that Torah, is it the same as our Torah? Is an interesting theological question, but it's not for us today. He reminds us that if you look at the patriarchs, they are peripatetic, moving from one place to another. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wandered across the entire world in their search for a person in whom the Spirit of God dwells, so that they might learn the service of God from this person, journeying from place to place, from land to land, for this purpose, until the ministering angels were compelled to study Torah with them. Why might this be? It's impossible to know God's unity. Achduto is his word here. God's unity, God's oneness. Now, of course, for the Hasidic masters, that doesn't just mean the belief in quantity. There is one God, but it's a matter of quality, which is to say that the divine being, capital B, permeates all existence. You cannot come to understand this except through apprenticeship to a master, Shimush Amid Chacham, who is like an angel. Without this, even if you take upon yourself all sorts of pious practices and customs, you cannot come to grasp God's oneness. Here, he makes a second point. Do not say to yourself, who is such a person filled with the Holy Spirit, who should become my master and minister, directing me along the path of the commandments? I'm greater than that person. Rather, remind the Morva Shemesh, be humble unto the dust of the earth, bend your knee, and remember to serve this master, who will show you the way in the service of the Creator. There are 2 points here that I'd like to draw out. One of them is that submission, or perhaps better, open-heartedness to another person, here the teacher, and receptivity toward that person teaches you to have that same approach for God. Open-heartedness toward a fellow person and toward a teacher leads to open-heartedness in the face of the divine. Now, by contrast, pridefulness and arrogance above all other people cannot but help be manifest in one's religious life, in one's devotional service. If you hold yourself up above all other people, claiming they have nothing to teach you, some element of that will occlude and damage your relationship with the divine. That doesn't answer the question of why you can't find it all by yourself. Here I think he suggests something quite profound, which is that to become awakened, to have a paradigm shift, a moment of transformative education is not simply about absorbing a new idea, of being rocked by a new way of reading a text given to you in a textbook. You can only see that through lived example. As Lewis said, the lived experience of the intercourse between a student and a teacher, and that kind of sacred interface is something that you cannot have when you're looking at a book. The way those ideas saturate into the fiber of your being, and the way that your mind can be awakened, the way that your heart can be opened. Lived experience with a teacher is entirely different. So it can't happen. This kind of religious quest, this kind of pedagogical quest cannot happen either in a vacuum or B, feeling that you yourself should be everyone else's teacher and no one's student. Now, I would also add that the Hasidic masters are well aware of the difficulties and complexities of the student-teacher relationship. In a text here on the parasha Rech, which of course begins, see before you, see, I have placed before you, this is God speaking, see, I have placed before you a blessing and a curse, and the injunction to choose life and choose the blessing rather than the curse. The Mor Shemesh reads it, Rabbi Kalonimus Kalman Epstein, as follows. The matter is thus. It's well known from oral testimonies and from books, something that he has seen and heard of, that the tzaddikim who walk in the prophetic path have the power to draw forth blessings from the upper worlds for whomever they choose. They can also draw forth a curse upon someone who is governed by hatred, meaning the tzaddik is not governed by hatred, but the person is governed by hatred. From generation to generation, the wondrous tzaddikim have had this power, as is known in our own generation. So far, he's describing the history of Hasidism, but also the miracle stories throughout the history of Kabbalah, throughout the rabbinic corpus, and certainly throughout the biblical text. Here, he adds something, and he adds something quite profound. The great tzaddikim, the righteous individuals, the teachers par excellence, have the ability to transfer this power to their students. This, says Rabbi Kalonimus Kalman, is the smicha, the rabbinic ordination, not a matter of conferral of authority here, but something else. This is the smicha when Moses places his hands upon Joshua's head that existed throughout the generation. So what is the smicha? What is the laying on of the hands? It is to convey the power of blessing from the teacher. Translated out of the context of miracle working and into the context of miraculous education, we might say that this is the ability of the teacher to confer within the student the ability to transform other people's lives. He then, however, acknowledges that this gift cannot be freely given. The most important thing, ha'ikar, is to remember what? That you must bless one who strives for God in their divine service, and you must not imbue this same power within someone whose character is unknown, because perhaps such a person is wicked and will use this blessing to become more successful in roguery. which is to say, one must be careful in choosing their disciples. It's true. One must be even more careful in choosing the disciples from whom they hold almost nothing back, giving even of their very essence to their disciples. Such a gift of spiritual power, such a gift of charisma, such a gift of power can be used. There's danger also in this interaction for the master or herself. That takes us to our fifth and final text. Here, you can see this on the slide. We won't read this all together. It's a recapitulation of the story of Moses transferring his authority from himself to Joshua in the book of Numbers. He puts his hands on Joshua's head and gives what the Bible describes of his honor. The Midrash here, and you have it, I'll tell you outside, gives two different illustrations of what this is. The first is like one person who lights a candle from another, and the second is like someone who pours from one vessel to another. Now, the Mor of Shemesh, picking up, I think, quite perceptively on the disjuncture in between these two examples, says, wait a minute, when you pour when you cross the fire from one candle to another, both candles continue to burn with the same power, with the same illumination. But if you pour something from one vessel to another, one vessel is full and the other is diminished. He then points out that this is true in our world of education. There are two models. One of them is when your disciples have taken themselves most of the way. You only need to add that final spark in order to illuminate them. They've worked long and hard, and it's simply a moment of inspiration that they require. On the other hand, we have disciples for whom that's not enough. Unto those disciples, says the Mor of Shemesh, you have to give even a portion of your own being. And that jumpstarts their own journey. Without that infusion of energy, they'll never be able to make it. Right? Sort of like a sourdough starter, which is a funny example. Without that infusion of energy, the disciple won't be able to make that progress. But drawing on that second image, the Mor of Shemesh points out, if that's true, you've given something of yourself away. You as the teacher have given a part of yourself that will forever live on in that disciple. You might say, it's dangerous for me. I'm afraid. For the Mor of Shemesh, for Colonus Kalman Epstein, that is not an excuse. As he said just a moment ago, you must be very careful deciding to whom you give this. But there are moments in life, there are moments in spiritual discipleship where you do have to give a part of your very essence to the student. That then allows them to become transformed, transform the world around them. I'd like to recap briefly these 5 lessons from the Hasidic world. The first is the power of presence. We, as educators, and we, as students, have to remember this. As teachers, we remember that it's not simply about what we say, and to some degree, it's not only about our pedagogy, although that is crucial and important. It's also about who we are. Our own inner world cannot help but inform our effectiveness and our ability to transform the people around us. The second point is that our disciples in some ways our living legacy. As someone who's involved in publication, writing is crucial. Writing is important, but no written word will ever have the same impact as the disciple to which you've poured time and energy and wisdom and love. The third point is that students cannot find the way alone. We as teachers need to remember to be there for them in their quest And we, as students, need to remember to always be on the lookout for teachers, because radical transformations and even slight shifts in consciousness and in the ways that we look at the world are best learned from lived example rather than from a book. Teachers, it's important to remember that the power to bless can also be the power to curse, which is to say that as we give our students gifts and as we teach them, we have to remember that there are cases in which withholding can be as wise as imbuing. But on the other hand, that could easily become an excuse for self-preservation on behalf of the teacher. And the danger to the teacher is pouring him or herself out entirely, spreading oneself too thin. And there is a very real danger in that. But on the other hand, say, I have no need to give to others, and I'm not going to do so because it will endanger me, is to eviscerate, to remove the very power of spiritual education, which boils down to the following equation: a soul meeting a soul in the context of a classroom, an encounter in the world, or even a moment of communication. I'd like to pause here, talk a little bit about the program at Hebrew College, but I also want to elicit forth comments, thoughts from the people who have joined us for today.
Ariel, could I ask a question?
Yes.
Modern education has suggested that we should put the child at the center of the learning experience, and the teacher would withdraw somewhat to allow the child to find their own way. Maybe even, there was a time, certainly when I was growing up, when teachers were told not to correct children's spelling because they should be allowed to find their own expression creatively. How does that modern thinking about education square with this Hasidic notion of the power of the teacher? And I'm particularly thinking of the fact that, on balance, the Hasidic movement moved the Rabbi into a very exalted role, a very saintly role, and whether that's still something we should consider for our modern classrooms.
There are elements in the Hasidic tradition that I think cut really against that, and in ways that would be not fruitful for many contemporary classrooms. However, the particular text from the Morva Shemesh here about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wandering around to find someone to learn from, and also the first text about the power of the presence of the teacher, I think the brilliance of that, and you see this so clearly in the writings of his descendant, of the Eish Kodesh, of the Piazetzner Rebbe, is it's not about content. What you do is create the space in which the teacher inspires the student to become their fullest self. And it's not about repetition, it's not about doing what I say, and in these texts and in so many others, it's not even about the impartment of information. That's not what education boils down to. What it boils down to is creating a situation in which the inquisitive child learns by example from that sort of leader, from that sort of teacher.
It's a bit of both.
Yep.
Thank you. That's very, very illuminating. I appreciate your insights.
Great question, Michael. That was a great question. Do you want to talk about the program? Do you want me to? Okay. Great. I just wanted to take one moment to talk about the two new programs, which is to say 2 new degrees that we're offering within the Hebrew College Graduate School. We are offering the Master's in Jewish Studies and now the Master's in Jewish Liberal Studies with 2 specializations, one in social and environmental change leadership and the other in Jewish spirituality and mysticism. These are both have a similar core curriculum that is founded in the study of Jewish tradition, culture, and thought throughout the ages, but each one then branches off into a series of core classes specific to that particular specialization that focuses on issues that we feel are of particular particularly important in a particular moment. The basic core curriculum involves courses from all the way from the Bible to the contemporary world, both surveys and intensive readings courses in biblical, rabbinic, medieval, and modern Jewish thought and culture. But the core courses that are within the particular specialization focus more on a particular thrust within the Jewish tradition or a particular issue. One of them focuses, as you see here, in Jewish spirituality and mysticism, has courses, as you see before you, an introduction to Jewish mysticism, which is spiritual journeys, a class on creation theology and its contemporary importance, a class called The Devotional Life on Jewish Spiritual Practices, which will be offered on rotating topics throughout the different years, Master and Disciple, Hasidic Wisdom, and the Student-Teacher Relationship. This is only one particular module of that larger course, which I think will actually be offered next semester, a class on holiness and community, on sacred fellowships and Jewish mysticism, and New Horizons, 20th century spirituality, neo-Hasidism, and modern Jewish mysticism. The social and environmental change leadership class, course of study has, of course, a rich coursework associated with it, everything from the inner life and social justice activism to the study of gender and social change in American Jewish life, Judaism and ecology as well. We also offer credit for internships for people who are interested in not only learning about these issues, but also working for them as activists in addition to being students. Program components are all available on the website, and I would steer everyone towards the new website that we've launched that explains all of these different issues. I'd like to open the floor up to questions or comments and any questions that people might have. Or if not, I can thank everyone for their time.
And a big part of our culture at Hebrew College is a culture of inquiry and of grappling with texts and concepts and kind of non-hierarchical learning, which really helps us, constantly be challenging the master-disciple relationship. So it would be very appropriate now if anybody has a question, but we'll give it a moment, and then if not, we'll close up.
This is Aura Weiss. I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not on.
I can hear you loud and clear.
I'm wondering how often you think this happens in these days, that someone will find a teacher that excites them in that way. Is it rare to find that kind of a relationship?
The answer is, I think, it's on different people. I can share my own experience. I feel a tremendous sense of blessing that every time I move from one teacher to another, I have found someone who transforms my life. I can tell you from the time I was 13, really 11, who my teacher was. And it's always been the kind of person that transforms me through their presence as well as through their teachings.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think there are a lot of people for whom that's not the case. And as an educator and as invested in the question of education in our time period, I think that one of the ultimate and most important issues for contemporary educators is, with all the caveats and with all the problematics of charismatic leadership and its possible misuses and its very real dangers, to be there for our students in that sort of way. I think the possibility is in no way diminished in our world, even with a healthy dose of skepticism, as most people have. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, I can't imagine something more important of education, of Jewish education, whether that's primary or higher education. I don't think it matters except in content and delivery, not in essence.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. I want to thank Ariel just for both teaching us about what it means to be in both of these roles and also modeling it with your very lovely way of giving over material about which you're clearly very passionate. If anyone learn more from Ariel, he's absolutely, I'm sure, would be really open to hearing from you. We have coursework that can be taken independently or as part of a program here in any of our departments. So there's lots more learning to do online, in person, and in just terms of building relationships. So thank you. We'll stay on for a couple minutes in case anybody wants to ask a one-on-one question, but class dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.